Close your eyes for a moment. Take a deep breath and imagine walking through a forest at night. The path ahead is invisible. Every shadow seems alive. Every rustle of leaves a potential threat. You are unsure, unsettled, wandering in darkness without a map, without a guide. This is what life feels like when we are lost in ignorance, a world where desires, fears, and illusions obscure reality. Yet, even in the darkest forest, a single light can guide the way. That light is mindfulness. It may seem small at first, almost fragile, but it has the power to illuminate every shadow that ignorance casts upon our minds. Mindfulness is not merely a technique. It is a revolution of perception, a gentle yet transformative force that reveals the truth of our inner world. Picture this: a young seeker, alone and restless, wandering through life without direction. He chases fleeting pleasures, reacts impulsively to every emotion, and drifts from one experience to another. Every day feels heavy with confusion, and every night deepens the shadow of uncertainty. Then someone whispers a simple instruction: pay attention, observe your breath, witness your mind. Skeptical, the seeker follows this instruction. At first, it seems trivial, almost too simple. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shift begins. Thoughts that once overwhelmed him now pass like clouds drifting across a clear sky. Emotions that once consumed him reveal themselves as temporary waves, not permanent storms. The light of mindfulness begins to shine, faint at first, yet unwavering, guiding him out of the darkness. Mindfulness, at its essence, is the practice of fully inhabiting the present moment. It is the act of observing reality with clarity, without judgment, without clinging. In a world dominated by distraction, it offers a sanctuary, a quiet space where we can see things as they truly are, unfiltered by assumptions, desires, or fear. This light, though subtle, exposes the patterns of the mind, the roots of suffering, and the illusions that keep us trapped in cycles of craving and aversion. Think of mindfulness as a lantern carried through the caverns of your consciousness. Each mindful breath illuminates a corner of your inner world that was previously hidden. Thoughts that once surged uncontrollably now become visible, understandable, and transformable. Feelings that once dictated your actions now become messengers, offering insights instead of instigating reaction. Slowly, as attention is nurtured, the darkness of ignorance recedes, replaced by clarity, peace, and wisdom. But mindfulness is not a light that shines for a moment and vanishes. It is a skill, a habit, a way of being that grows stronger the more it is practiced. Just as a candle can light another candle without diminishing its own flame, mindfulness spreads, touching every aspect of life, from the simplest daily routines to the deepest emotional experiences. Drinking tea becomes a meditation, walking becomes a revelation, and even moments of discomfort can transform into profound lessons. In this journey, mindfulness is the first step toward freedom. It does not erase challenges, nor does it promise a life free of difficulty. What it does is allow us to meet reality as it is, without distortion, without panic. It illuminates the present moment, revealing the beauty hidden within ordinary experiences and offering clarity in times of confusion. With each mindful breath, we begin to understand that darkness is not an enemy. It is merely the space where light has not yet reached. So, as we embark on this journey together, remember this: the light of mindfulness is always within reach. It is a quiet, steady flame, waiting to guide anyone willing to pause, observe, and awaken. In the chapters that follow, we will explore how this light interacts with the darkness of ignorance, how it transforms suffering, and how it can illuminate every corner of our lives, if we dare to follow its glow. As we step deeper into the journey, it becomes clear that mindfulness is not just a light shining randomly in the dark. Its brilliance is most meaningful because there is darkness to illuminate. And this darkness, in the realm of the mind, is what Buddhism calls ignorance. Ignorance is not simply a lack of information or knowledge. It is a subtle, pervasive misunderstanding of reality itself. It convinces us that what is fleeting is permanent, that what brings temporary pleasure can satisfy us forever, and that the self we cling to is unchanging. Ignorance is the fog that colors every perception, the silent whisper that convinces us we are separate from the world and from each other. It is the root from which all suffering springs. Imagine living your life as if the world were painted in shadows and illusions. You grasp at moments, hoping they will stay, cling to people, expecting them never to leave, and react to emotions as if they define who you are. Each choice, each reaction is filtered through the lens of misunderstanding. Fear, anger, jealousy, and desire thrive here. They seem real, urgent, unavoidable. And yet they are born from a misperception, a darkness waiting to be pierced by the light of awareness. Consider the story of a young woman named Maya. She lives in a bustling city, consumed by ambition and the pursuit of status. She believes that success will finally bring her peace, but each achievement feels hollow, each moment of triumph followed by restlessness. She cannot understand why joy slips through her fingers like water. She is trapped in a maze built by her own mind, a maze created by ignorance. And within this maze, every decision, every desire, every regret feels heavier than the last. The darkness is not outside of her, it lives within. This is the nature of ignorance, invisible yet all-encompassing. It shapes our perceptions, governs our choices, and fuels the endless cycle of suffering, known in Buddhism as samsara. It is not evil, nor is it a flaw. It is simply the human condition, a lens through which we interpret life without seeing it as it truly is. Yet the darkness is not absolute. Awareness, once cultivated, begins to reveal the contours of this fog. Even the smallest flicker of mindfulness can uncover the roots of habitual patterns, the ways in which we unconsciously create pain. When Maya begins to notice her thoughts, observing her ambition without judgment, her restlessness without reacting, the maze she once believed in starts to dissolve. The walls, built of misunderstanding, begin to crumble. Shadows retreat as the light of clarity begins to touch them. Ignorance thrives on distraction and habitual thought. In our modern world, this is easier than ever. Endless notifications, constant comparison, and relentless stimulation pull our attention outward, feeding the illusion that life is something we must chase, rather than something to be experienced. Each moment we overlook is a moment where darkness gains strength. And yet, mindfulness is always available, a gentle turning inward, a pause to observe, a choice to see clearly. The key is recognition. To practice mindfulness effectively, we must first recognize the presence of ignorance. It is not enough to seek peace blindly or to follow techniques mechanically. We must see the ways in which we misunderstand ourselves, the world, and the impermanent nature of all things. Once recognized, ignorance loses its power, and mindfulness becomes not just a light but a tool for liberation. In this recognition, there is both humility and hope. Humility, because we see how easily the mind is deceived, how fragile our assumptions can be. Hope, because we realize that even the smallest act of awareness can pierce the darkness. Like a lantern in a cavern, mindfulness does not destroy the darkness with force, but reveals the truth hidden within it. And as we shine this light, even the most impenetrable shadows begin to dissolve. So, as we continue this journey, let us carry the awareness of our own inner darkness. Let us acknowledge the illusions that guide our actions, the patterns that trap us, and the beliefs that cloud our perception. For only by seeing clearly can the light of mindfulness take root, grow, and transform our experience. And as this light spreads, it will not stop at illuminating the darkness within us. It will ripple outward, touching the world in ways we may not yet imagine. This is the promise of mindfulness, a way to meet the truth of our inner world without fear, to observe the shadows without judgment, and to begin walking in clarity where before there was confusion. And as the path unfolds, we begin to understand that the darkness we feared is not an enemy, but an invitation to awaken. If ignorance is the darkness that clouds our perception, then mindfulness is the lantern that illuminates every corner of our inner world. Not a harsh, blinding light, but a gentle, steady glow that reveals the truth hidden in plain sight. It is the art of seeing without distortion, observing without attachment, and being present without judgment. Mindfulness is often misunderstood as simply paying attention or focusing the mind. While attention is part of it, true mindfulness goes deeper. It is an intimate awareness of the present moment, not just noticing what happens outside, but witnessing what unfolds within. Thoughts, emotions, bodily sensations, and even the spaces between them are all observed with clarity and compassion. In this way, mindfulness becomes a lantern guiding us through the labyrinth of our own consciousness. Imagine walking into a darkened room filled with countless objects. In darkness, everything appears confusing, threatening, or even meaningless. But as soon as a single lantern is lit, each object is revealed, its shape, texture, and position. Suddenly, what was overwhelming becomes understandable. In the same way, mindfulness illuminates our thoughts and emotions. The fear that once paralyzed us, the anger that once controlled us, the longing that once consumed us, all become visible, manageable, and transient. The lantern shows us not just what is, but how it truly is. Consider the story of Kavi, a young monk who struggled with restless thoughts and emotional turbulence. He tried countless practices, but nothing seemed to calm his mind. One day his teacher instructed him, "Sit, watch your breath, do not interfere, do not chase, let everything be." At first, Kavi resisted. How could sitting quietly and observing change anything? But as he persisted, something remarkable happened. He began to notice the patterns of his mind, thoughts that arose and fell, emotions that surged and subsided. The storm of his inner world did not vanish, but he no longer feared it. The lantern of mindfulness revealed its nature, and in that light, he discovered freedom. Mindfulness is not about eliminating the darkness entirely. It is about cultivating the ability to navigate it with clarity. Just as a lantern does not remove the night but illuminates the path, mindfulness allows us to walk through life with awareness, seeing reality as it truly is. It exposes the illusions created by craving, aversion, and ignorance, allowing us to respond to life skillfully rather than react impulsively. At its core, mindfulness is both simple and profound. It begins with small, intentional acts, noticing your breath, observing the sensation of walking, feeling the warmth of the sun on your skin. These tiny sparks of awareness, practiced consistently, expand into a sustained illumination of the mind. Over time, the lantern grows brighter, capable of revealing deeper truths about the self, the world, and the nature of experience. The power of mindfulness lies in its consistency, not intensity. A brief moment of mindful attention may seem insignificant, but when nurtured day by day, it transforms perception. The chaotic mind gradually becomes calm, the restless heart gradually finds steadiness, and the tangled web of thoughts gradually reveals its patterns. What once felt like an overwhelming darkness now becomes navigable, even familiar. We learn that the mind is not an enemy to conquer, but a landscape to explore, illuminated by the lantern of awareness. And mindfulness is not limited to formal meditation. It is alive in every act of life, sipping tea, washing dishes, walking through a garden, or listening deeply to another person. Each moment carries the potential to shine light on ignorance, to reveal what was hidden, and to awaken understanding. The lantern is always with us, we only need to pick it up. In essence, mindfulness transforms experience itself. Life is no longer a series of random, overwhelming events, but a continuous flow of moments to be observed, understood, and embraced. The lantern does not make life perfect, but it reveals what is real, allowing us to move with insight rather than confusion, with presence rather than distraction. As we continue, this lantern will guide us into the heart of suffering, showing how mindfulness can illuminate the roots of pain, and ultimately reveal a path toward freedom. It is here, in the gentle yet unwavering light of awareness, that we begin to understand that our inner world, no matter how chaotic or dark, is not a place to fear, but a terrain to explore. And with each mindful step, we grow closer to the clarity, peace, and insight that have always been waiting for us. Pain is inevitable. Every human life encounters it in the form of loss, disappointment, fear, or heartbreak. Yet most of us spend our lives running from it, resisting it, or numbing it. And in doing so, we amplify our suffering. But what if there was a different way, a way to meet pain not as an enemy, but as a teacher? This is where mindfulness enters, offering a light that allows us to see clearly through the shadows of suffering. Suffering, or dukkha as it is called in Buddhism, is not only the physical or emotional pain we feel, but also the subtle dissatisfaction that pervades our lives. It is the sense that something is missing, the restlessness beneath pleasure, the fear beneath joy. Mindfulness does not promise to erase this suffering, but it provides a lens to understand it deeply. Through awareness, we can observe pain without being consumed by it, see its impermanent nature, and recognize the patterns that give rise to it. Imagine a young man named Ravi who has recently lost his job. At first, panic grips him, anxiety, fear, and self-doubt swirl uncontrollably. He relives past failures and worries about the future. His suffering is not only the loss itself, but the storm of thoughts and emotions he attaches to it. One day, he decides to practice mindfulness, sitting quietly, observing his breath, and noticing the sensations of fear and sadness without judgment. Slowly, he begins to see that his emotions are temporary, that they rise and fall like waves. The pain is still present, but it no longer controls him. The lantern of mindfulness illuminates the experience, allowing him to respond rather than react. Mindfulness teaches us that suffering is not to be denied or ignored. It asks us to meet it with clarity and presence. When we do, we discover that pain carries insight, lessons about attachment, expectation, and the transient nature of life. Every difficulty becomes an opportunity to practice awareness, every moment of discomfort a chance to understand the mind's patterns. The practice is simple in principle but profound in effect. When an emotion arises, anger, grief, fear, we notice it, name it silently, and breathe through it. We allow the mind to observe itself, to recognize habitual reactions, and to release the grip of automatic judgment. In this process, suffering loses its intensity. It transforms from an oppressive force into a teacher, revealing truths that would remain hidden in distraction or denial. Consider the metaphor of a storm at sea. Without mindfulness, the waves toss the ship violently and fear takes hold. With mindfulness, we are still in the storm, but we navigate it with awareness. We see each wave, understand its nature, and adjust our course. The storm has not disappeared, but we are no longer at its mercy. This is the power of mindfulness, not the removal of pain, but the transformation of our relationship to it. In everyday life, suffering appears in countless forms: a harsh word from a friend, a health scare, an unmet expectation, or even the subtle anxiety that arises from uncertainty. Mindfulness invites us to pause, breathe, and observe. By doing so, we see clearly that our suffering is not permanent, not inherently personal, and not the entirety of our experience. It is a passing wave in the vast ocean of consciousness, illuminated by awareness. Through this lens, we begin to understand that the light of mindfulness does more than comfort us. It empowers us. It teaches resilience, patience, and compassion. We learn to witness pain in ourselves and others with clarity and empathy. The suffering of life is not eliminated, but its hold is loosened. We are free to respond skillfully rather than react blindly, to act with wisdom rather than fear. Mindfulness also reveals the interconnected nature of suffering. We see how our actions, thoughts, and attachments contribute not only to our own pain, but to the pain of others. With this understanding comes a profound sense of responsibility and compassion. The light that shines in our own darkness naturally extends outward, touching the lives of those around us. In this way, mindfulness transforms suffering from a private torment into a universal opportunity for awakening. So, As we continue this journey, remember that suffering is not the enemy of mindfulness. It is the arena in which the lantern shines brightest. The pain we encounter is the shadow against which awareness reveals its brilliance. By seeing clearly through the discomfort, we awaken to a deeper understanding of life and discover that even in the darkest moments, the light of mindfulness guides the way. Mindfulness is not reserved for quiet meditation halls or serene mountain retreats. Its true power emerges when it enters the ordinary moments of daily life. Every breath, every step, every action can become a doorway to awareness, a chance to illuminate the shadows of habitual distraction and to touch the present fully. Consider the simple act of drinking a cup of tea. Most of us do it while scrolling on our phones or thinking about tomorrow's tasks. The experience passes unnoticed, swallowed by busyness. But with mindfulness, this ordinary moment transforms. You feel the warmth of the cup in your hands, notice the subtle aroma, observe the taste as it unfolds on your tongue. You are fully present, fully alive in this one experience. A small act becomes a profound reminder that life is composed of countless fleeting moments, moments to be observed, savored, and appreciated. Walking offers another extraordinary opportunity for mindfulness. Each step can anchor you in the present. Feel your feet connecting with the ground, notice the rhythm of your movements, the sway of your body, the air brushing against your skin. Walking becomes not a means to a destination but a meditation in motion. The ordinary act of moving through space becomes a vivid exploration of life itself. Even in work, mindfulness can make a difference. Tasks that once felt tedious or overwhelming, sending emails, organizing files, cooking dinner, become opportunities to practice awareness. We notice our thoughts, observe our emotions, and engage fully with each action. Life ceases to be a relentless race toward the next moment and becomes a series of conscious, meaningful engagements with the present. Let's return to the story of Maya, the young woman caught in the chase for status and success. Once, she rushed through her mornings, sipping coffee while checking messages, mentally planning the day. Everything felt rushed, stressful, incomplete. Then she began experimenting with mindfulness. She paused to observe her breath before rising from bed, felt the water on her hands while washing them, fully experienced the flavors of her breakfast. Slowly, a remarkable shift occurred. She began noticing the subtle beauty in ordinary moments, the richness in routine, and the stillness that existed beneath the noise of her mind. Daily life, once a source of stress, became a canvas for presence and awareness. Mindfulness is not about perfection. It is about noticing, moment by moment, without judgment. Sometimes the mind wanders, sometimes emotions surge. This is natural. The practice is in returning to the present again and again, gently, patiently. Each return strengthens the lantern, making it brighter and more resilient, capable of illuminating even the most ordinary or challenging moments. Even emotional challenges, when approached mindfully, can become lessons in presence. When anger arises, instead of reacting impulsively, we notice its intensity, observe how it moves through the body and breathe through it. When sadness appears, we allow it to be felt fully, noticing its impermanence. Mindfulness transforms the way we engage with our inner world. Life no longer feels like a relentless storm but a flowing river with currents, waves, and still pools, all to be observed with attention and acceptance. Small, consistent practices build profound impact. Just a few minutes of mindful breathing in the morning, a mindful pause before a meal, or a brief moment to notice sensations during the day accumulates into lasting transformation. The lantern we carry grows stronger, casting light on deeper corners of thought, emotion, and perception. Over time, even routine activities, folding laundry, walking to work, conversing with a friend, become opportunities to live fully awake, to move through life with clarity, compassion, and presence. Mindfulness in daily life also enhances our relationships. By being fully present with others, we listen more deeply, speak more thoughtfully, and respond more skillfully. Our presence becomes a gift to those around us, a reflection of the light we cultivate within. Ordinary interactions, once rushed, distracted, or shallow, gain depth, warmth, and authenticity. And perhaps the most profound aspect is this: mindfulness shows us that awakening is not a distant goal. It is not hidden in faraway monasteries or in the mastery of complex techniques. It is available here, in this moment, in the ordinary and mundane, waiting to be noticed. Each small act of awareness is a step toward liberation, a way to dissolve the darkness of ignorance one moment at a time. As we move through the simple, ordinary rhythms of life with awareness, we begin to see a profound truth. The light of mindfulness is not limited to formal practice. It is woven into the fabric of daily existence, and as it spreads, it naturally prepares us to face life's challenges, its deeper fears and pains, with clarity and resilience. The lantern we carry grows brighter, and the world itself becomes more vivid, more alive, and more meaningful. In this way, mindfulness transforms not only our inner world but also the world we touch. Each mindful action radiates outward, influencing how we think, feel, and connect. The ordinary becomes extraordinary, and life itself becomes a practice, a continuous unfolding of presence, awareness, and awakening. We live in a world overflowing with noise. Phones buzz incessantly, notifications demand our attention, and our minds race from one thought to the next. It is a world designed to pull us outward, away from the present moment and deeper into distraction. Yet in the midst of this chaos, mindfulness remains our anchor, a steady lantern guiding us through the storm. Distractions are more than mere interruptions. They are manifestations of our own restless minds, our habitual attachment to novelty, and our unconscious desire to avoid discomfort. The constant pull of external stimuli keeps us trapped in a reactive cycle, reacting to notifications, responding to impulses, and drifting from one thought to another without ever pausing to truly see what is happening. Consider the story of Arjun, a young professional living in a bustling city. His day begins with checking emails and messages, continues with back-to-back meetings, and ends with scrolling endlessly through social media. Despite accomplishing much, he feels a constant sense of unrest, a fatigue that comes not from work but from being perpetually pulled in multiple directions. The chaos outside mirrors the turbulence inside, a mind fragmented, rarely present, rarely still. Mindfulness offers a way out, not by removing the world's noise but by changing how we engage with it. It invites us to pause, even for a few moments, and to observe where our attention is going. When a notification appears, when a thought intrudes, when emotions surge, mindfulness asks us to notice without judgment. Here it is. This is what is happening, and I am here too. This gentle awareness creates a space between stimulus and response, between chaos and calm. Simple practices can anchor us in the present. A mindful breath before opening a message, a brief pause to notice sensations in the body, or a single moment of observing the surroundings while walking through a street can create ripples of presence that expand throughout the day. These moments, though brief, gradually strengthen our capacity to remain centered amidst distractions. Imagine sitting in a crowded cafe. Conversations, clinking cups, music, and the hum of activity surround you. Without mindfulness, the mind is pulled in all directions. With mindfulness, you can sit fully aware, noticing sounds without judgment, observing your thoughts without getting lost, feeling your body without tension. The chaos remains, but it no longer controls your experience. You are present, aware, and undisturbed by the external tumult. Technology presents both a challenge and an opportunity. While it constantly vies for our attention, it can also serve as a reminder to practice mindfulness. Each alert or ping becomes an invitation to pause, breathe, and reconnect with the present. Over time, these small acts cultivate resilience, allowing us to navigate a world designed for distraction without losing our center. Beyond external distractions, mindfulness helps us confront internal ones. The stories our minds tell, the worries about the future, the regrets of the past. These mental diversions are often more consuming than any external noise. By observing them with awareness, we recognize their transient nature. Thoughts arise and pass. Emotions surge and fade. The mind is not the master of these distractions, we are. The lantern of mindfulness illuminates the space between stimulus and reaction, granting us freedom to choose clarity over chaos. The true power of mindfulness in a chaotic world lies in its cumulative effect. Each moment of presence, each pause to observe, strengthens the mind's capacity to remain grounded. Over time, we develop an inner sanctuary, a space untouched by the constant pull of distraction. Life becomes less about reacting and more about responding. We reclaim our attention, our energy, and our clarity. And here is the profound truth. The world will never stop being chaotic, but we can train ourselves to move through it with awareness. Mindfulness does not demand escape from life's complexity. It teaches engagement with it, fully awake and fully present. Like a lantern cutting through dense fog, mindfulness reveals the path, moment by moment, guiding us through the noise, toward focus, insight, and peace. As we continue our journey, the next step is to explore how mindfulness interacts with the very core of our emotional life, how it can transform fear, anger, and desire into understanding and compassion. For it is here, in the midst of distraction and chaos, that the practice of mindful presence shows its deepest impact. Emotions are the vibrant colors of human experience, yet they can also be the shadows that cloud our minds. Fear, anger, desire, these powerful currents often sweep us away, driving actions and reactions that leave us restless, reactive, or regretful. But what if we could meet these emotions with clarity, allowing them to teach rather than control us? This is the transformative power of mindfulness. Mindfulness does not ask us to suppress or ignore emotions. It does not seek to create a sterile calm or an artificial detachment. Instead, it invites us to observe, to witness the rise and fall of feelings, to understand their nature, and to discover the lessons they carry. In doing so, we learn to transform raw energy into insight, chaos into clarity. Take fear, for example. Fear often paralyzes us, telling stories about danger that may or may not exist. When faced with fear, most people react automatically, avoiding, resisting, or denying it. Mindfulness, however, asks us to pause, feel the fear without judgment. Notice its location in the body, its texture, its rhythm. Breathe into it. Observe it as a temporary visitor. In this act of witnessing, the grip of fear begins to loosen. It is no longer an overpowering force, but a signal, a messenger, offering insight into what we value and what we might need to understand or protect. Anger, too, reveals its true nature when approached mindfully. It often feels like a fire that must consume, an impulse that must act immediately. Yet mindfulness allows us to observe the sparks before they ignite. We notice the tension in the body, the thoughts racing through the mind, the desire to lash out. By simply observing without suppressing or reacting, we gain space to choose, to act with wisdom rather than impulse. Anger transforms from a destructive force into an opportunity for clarity, self-understanding, and sometimes even compassion. Desire, the pull toward pleasure, success, or recognition, can be equally consuming. It drives much of human behavior, yet when unchecked, it leads to dissatisfaction, craving, and endless longing. Mindfulness invites us to see desire clearly, to notice its arising, its impermanence, and its role in shaping our actions. We begin to understand that fulfillment is not in the object of desire, but in the awareness of the moment, in the freedom to respond with intention rather than compulsion. Desire becomes a teacher, not a tyrant. Consider the story of Leela, a woman who struggled with intense anxiety and habitual anger. Every minor irritation triggered a storm of thoughts and reactions. Her relationships suffered, and she felt trapped by her own emotions. Through daily mindfulness practice, observing her breath, noticing bodily sensations, acknowledging feelings without judgment, she began to notice patterns. She saw how fear amplified small worries, how anger arose from unmet expectations, and how desire often masked insecurity. Slowly, the intensity of her emotions diminished. She did not stop feeling. She stopped being enslaved by her feelings. Her emotional life became a source of insight, a path towards self-understanding and liberation. The key to transforming emotions lies in presence. Mindfulness allows us to step back from the automatic scripts that run our emotional lives. We learn to observe without judgment, to feel without attachment, and to act with wisdom. In this space, emotions no longer dominate, they communicate. They reveal the unmet needs, the hidden fears, the attachments that shape our experience. And when understood with clarity, they dissolve their own power over us. Moreover, mindfulness nurtures compassion for ourselves and others. When we observe our own fear, anger, and desire without judgment, we cultivate patience and understanding. We realize that others, too, are navigating their own inner storms. Awareness of our shared humanity softens resentment, opens hearts, and allows empathy to flourish. Emotions transform from obstacles into bridges, connecting us more deeply to ourselves and the world around us. The process is not always easy. Mindful observation requires courage, honesty, and consistency. Emotions can be intense, even overwhelming, but each moment of mindful awareness strengthens our capacity to meet life fully, to witness without being consumed, and to act skillfully. Over time, the lantern of mindfulness illuminates the entire emotional landscape, revealing its impermanent, interconnected, and ultimately transformable nature. In this way, mindfulness turns fear, anger, and desire from forces that scatter our energy into teachers that guide our understanding. The storms of emotion do not vanish, but our relationship to them shifts. We move from reaction to insight, from chaos to clarity, from suffering to awareness. And as we cultivate this skill, we discover a profound truth. The light of mindfulness does not merely illuminate our thoughts or actions. It penetrates the very currents of feeling, transforming the raw intensity of life into conscious experience. We learn to move through the world with presence, balance, and a steady heart, no matter what arises. From here, the path naturally extends outward. As our emotional awareness grows, so does our capacity for compassion and empathy, allowing the light of mindfulness to touch not only ourselves, but the lives of those around us. And this is the bridge to the next step, understanding how mindfulness nurtures compassion, insight, and connection in the broader world. As the lantern of mindfulness illuminates our inner world, its light does not stop at the boundaries of the self. It reaches outward, touching the lives of others, cultivating a profound sense of compassion. Mindfulness and compassion are inseparable. One reveals clarity, the other inspires care. Together, they transform the way we move through the world. Compassion is not merely a sentiment or a fleeting feeling of kindness. It is the natural consequence of truly seeing reality, of observing the suffering, fear, and longing in ourselves, and recognizing it in others. Mindfulness trains us to perceive the subtleties of our own pain, the patterns of our own heart, and the impermanence of our own experiences. And in this clarity, a door opens. The understanding that all beings navigate the same currents of existence, the same storms of emotion, the same moments of vulnerability. Consider a story of Tenzin, a young teacher who often found herself frustrated by the constant demands of her students. Initially, she reacted with impatience and irritation, believing that her energy was constantly being drained. One day, she decided to approach her work mindfully, noticing her own reactions, observing her impatience without judgment, and allowing herself to breathe through moments of tension. Gradually, she began to perceive the struggles, fears, and insecurities behind each student's behavior. Compassion arose naturally. She responded not with irritation but with patience, understanding, and kindness. The light of mindfulness, once contained within herself, had expanded outward, transforming the world around her. Mindfulness reveals that our connection to others is not a moral obligation, but a natural extension of awareness. When we see the world clearly, we notice the subtle ways in which our actions, words, and presence affect those around us. A smile, a listening ear, a moment of patience, these small acts, infused with awareness, ripple outward, touching lives in ways that may never be fully visible. Compassion, when grounded in mindfulness, is not selective. It is a consistent response to the recognition of shared humanity. Furthermore, mindfulness cultivates empathy by revealing the interconnected nature of existence. We come to understand that our suffering is not isolated, and that the happiness of others is intertwined with our own. In this awareness, compassion becomes spontaneous, unforced, and profoundly liberating. It is not limited to grand gestures or heroic acts. It flourishes in the ordinary, everyday moments, offering understanding to a colleague, patience to a family member, kindness to a stranger. The transformation is subtle but powerful. A heart that once reacted with judgment or resentment begins to respond with curiosity and care. Conflicts soften, relationships deepen, and a sense of purpose emerges. Mindfulness teaches us that awareness is not self-contained. It has a natural outward flow. The lantern we carry within does not merely illuminate our own path. It lights the way for others, gently guiding, supporting, and inspiring. Compassion rooted in mindfulness also transforms how we relate to suffering itself. We no longer turn away from pain, ours or others, with fear or avoidance. Instead, we approach it with clarity, presence, and understanding. In doing so, suffering becomes a teacher, and our response shifts from reaction to mindful action. The world does not change magically, but our relationship to it does. Life becomes richer, more meaningful, and imbued with a sense of shared humanity. Even small moments of compassion can be transformative. A conscious breath before responding to a loved one, a mindful pause before reacting to irritation, a deliberate act of kindness. These are not mere gestures. They are expressions of awakened awareness, reflections of the inner lantern shining outward. Over time, these small acts accumulate, creating a life that radiates mindfulness and compassion in every corner. The ripple effect is profound. One mindful, compassionate act can inspire another. Awareness spreads naturally, touching not just those we encounter directly, but the wider world in ways we cannot always see. In this way, the lantern grows brighter, the light expands, and the shadows of ignorance and indifference recede. As we nurture mindfulness and allow it to blossom into compassion, we recognize a profound truth. The journey of awareness is not solitary. Our awakening, our clarity, and our insight are inseparable from the lives of others. The light within us illuminates not just our own darkness, but also the darkness of the world around us. And this is the essence of mindful living. A life where awareness and compassion flow seamlessly, moment by moment, heart to heart, illuminating the path for ourselves and all beings. From here, the next step is to explore the obstacles that inevitably arise on the path, the challenges to maintaining this mindful and compassionate presence in a world that constantly tests our focus and our patience. Understanding these challenges is essential, for they offer another opportunity to deepen our practice and strengthen the light within. Even the brightest lantern faces the wind. Even the most devoted practitioner encounters storms. On the path of mindfulness, obstacles are inevitable. Distraction, doubt, fatigue, emotional turbulence, and the relentless pull of old habits constantly test our presence. Yet these challenges are not failures. They are essential teachers, shaping our practice, deepening our awareness, and refining the strength of our inner light. Consider distraction, ever-present thief of attention. In our modern world, it is everywhere: screens, notifications, endless tasks, and the constant chatter of the mind. The mind craves novelty, clings to past regrets, and projects into the future. It resists being fully present. Mindfulness teaches us to notice this, to recognize the moment our awareness drifts, and gently return to the present. Each return strengthens the lantern, just as lifting a weight repeatedly builds muscle. Doubt is another obstacle, subtle yet powerful. We may question the practice itself. Am I doing it right? Is this really helping? Will this ever make a difference? These thoughts can undermine progress if we are not careful. Mindfulness does not dismiss doubt, it observes it. By watching our uncertainty arise, we see that doubt is transient, a passing cloud in the sky of awareness. We acknowledge it, learn from it, and continue forward. Emotional turbulence presents a deeper challenge. Life inevitably brings loss, fear, anger, and longing. At times, emotions surge so strongly that mindfulness feels impossible. Yet it is precisely in these moments that practice becomes most vital. Instead of resisting, we sit with the storm. We observe the rise and fall of sensations, thoughts, and impulses. In doing so, we discover that emotions, no matter how intense, are impermanent. They can be witnessed, understood, and transformed. Physical fatigue, too, tests our resolve. Early mornings, long workdays, or sleepless nights make it tempting to abandon practice. Yet even brief moments of awareness, a mindful breath, a few steps observed while walking, or noticing sensations in the body can sustain the lantern. Mindfulness adapts to circumstances. It does not demand perfection, only consistent presence. Consider the story of Sita, a teacher who struggled to maintain mindfulness amid the chaos of her daily life. She felt pulled in countless directions, exhausted by responsibilities, and frustrated by the seeming futility of practice. Yet each day she committed to small acts of presence, a mindful pause before speaking, attention to her breath during short breaks, listening fully to students without distraction. Slowly, the accumulated moments of awareness strengthened her resilience. The obstacles did not disappear, but her relationship to them changed. She was no longer controlled by the challenges. She met them with clarity and grace. Obstacles on the path are not signs of failure. They are reminders that mindfulness is a living practice, dynamic and evolving. Every difficulty encountered is an opportunity to deepen awareness, cultivate patience, and strengthen presence. Each challenge illuminates patterns of reactivity, reveals attachments, and invites us to meet life with wisdom rather than avoidance. Importantly, mindfulness in the face of obstacles nurtures self-compassion. When we stumble, drift, or falter, we observe without harsh judgment. We acknowledge our humanity and return gently to practice. This compassionate approach prevents discouragement and reinforces the inner lantern. The path is not about perfection. It is about persistent, mindful engagement with life as it is. Obstacles also teach us the subtle interplay between effort and surrender. Too much effort can create tension, frustration, or rigidity. Too little can lead to distraction or passivity. Mindfulness invites a balance, effortful attention coupled with relaxed presence. Like a skilled sailor navigating rough seas, we adjust our sails according to the winds, maintaining direction while remaining flexible. This balance deepens the power and resilience of the lantern within. As we face obstacles with mindfulness, we discover a profound truth. Challenges are not hindrances to awakening. They are integral to it. The darkness of distraction, doubt, and turbulence allows the light of awareness to shine with greater clarity. Without obstacles, the lantern's strength would remain untested. With them, it becomes a source of insight, stability, and freedom. And so, the practice continues, not in the absence of difficulty, but in its midst. Each challenge met mindfully reinforces the connection between awareness, presence, and compassion. Every moment of struggle becomes an opportunity to illuminate the inner landscape, to strengthen the lantern, and to prepare for the ultimate journey, the culmination of mindfulness, wisdom, and liberation. From here, the natural step is to bring the journey full circle, to reflect on the awakening we began with, the insights gained, the light cultivated, and the path ahead. This brings us to the final chapter, where we explore the essence of mindfulness as a lifelong companion, guiding us through the darkness and illuminating every step of the way. The very first spark of awareness to the steady glow that now illuminates our understanding. We have journeyed together through the essence of mindfulness. We began by awakening to the presence of our own minds, ventured into the shadows of ignorance, and learned to carry the lantern of mindfulness through the turbulence of life. Along the way, we discovered how mindfulness transforms suffering, illuminates emotions, enriches daily life, and flows outward into compassion for others. Mindfulness is not a destination, it is a lifelong companion. Its light is steady yet gentle. It does not demand perfection, nor does it judge the darkness it encounters. Instead, it meets each moment with clarity, patience, and presence. It teaches us to observe without attachment, to feel without being consumed, and to respond with insight rather than impulse. The lantern we carry within is ever present, waiting for us to lift it, moment by moment. The journey does not end here. Every breath, every step, every encounter is an opportunity to cultivate presence. Each challenge, each distraction, each wave of emotion is a chance to deepen our understanding and expand the light we carry. In this way, mindfulness is both the path and the guide, revealing the impermanence of all things while offering a steady grounding in the truth of the present. As we carry this awareness forward, we begin to see life differently, not as a series of obstacles to endure, but as a living, unfolding experience to witness. The lantern of mindfulness does not remove darkness. It illuminates it, showing us what is, what changes, and what is truly essential. And in this light, we move through life with clarity, compassion, and a quiet joy that arises naturally from presence. If this journey has resonated with you, remember that the practice of mindfulness is always within reach. Take a moment now to breathe deeply, observe your surroundings, or simply notice your own presence. These small steps are the foundation of profound transformation. And if this video has touched your heart, or sparked even a small sense of awareness within you, I invite you to continue this journey with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom and join a community dedicated to exploring the teachings of the Buddha, cultivating mindfulness, and embracing the light within every moment. Hit the notification bell to stay connected, and allow the lantern of awareness to guide you in every step of your life. May your path be illuminated. May your heart remain open. And may the light of mindfulness continue to shine in your life, moment by moment, breath by breath.